North America has one of the most insane archaeological histories that you could ever imagine. And the funny part is that most people have no idea this exists at all. When people look at North America, pretty much everybody just thinks that North American Indians lived here for 8 trillion years and all they did was wander around, hunt buffalo, and live in teepees. Like that is literally what most people believe about North American history. And then, of course, eventually Europeans will show up and they'll ruin everything. They're all these terrible people and blah, blah, blah. And then we get to the situation that we find ourselves in today, where the masses are being psychologically conditioned to hate one another. And, okay, I'm not going to get into anything. Okay. But the main point here is that North American history to the general public is not known. Most people have no idea how rich and insane North American Indian history is by itself. Most people have no idea that North American Indian history has recountings such as how they got to North America and how recent this event was, or why they came to North America at all, or that when they arrived in North America, there were already other people here. Yeah, this is what the vast majority of people have no clue about. And that's just a little tiny bit of the history. Right? When you start to listen to their history and you see what they're talking about, and you see the adventures, and you see what was going on back during these time periods, it has nothing to do with the way the mainstream currently looks at history. Nothing at all. I mean, it's a completely different picture. Of course, that picture does not jive with the mainstream's version of history, so it has to all be fake. It has to all just be legend or craziness, or they were all high or whatever, right? You are not allowed to take anything they say seriously. But it's also simultaneously important to really, really preserve everything, but just don't listen to it. Don't pay attention to what it says, right? Don't pay attention to the implications. Just assume that all of North American history is essentially caveman level garbage. Ignore all the archaeological evidence that shows all kinds of stuff, and just think that North America is boring until the Europeans show up and start ruining everything, and now everybody needs to hate each other. I mean, that is literally what is going on right now, and that is what the vast majority of people are doing with North American history. There's a problem, however. When you start to pay attention to real North American history, everything changes. Everything changes. Like the entire landscape changes. And this change is exactly what the system does not want to happen. Because if everybody starts paying attention to real history, and in this case North American history, that means everything that is going on today is suddenly painted in a completely different light. And people might actually start to look at their lives differently than they look at them now, and might start to question why they're doing what they're doing right now. And they might start to question the authoritative institutions who have been lying to them for centuries. And you can't have that. You can't have that because there are people right now who benefit from all of these lies. They benefit from all of these historical distortions. Right? It's no secret. If you have 3 brain cells, it's painfully obvious that what's going on in the mainstream right now, like the mainstream media, everything, mainstream history, mainstream science, is there to do one thing and one thing only. Right? It's there to create friction. It is simple divide and conquer, right? That's all that's going on. And North American history has absolutely become a victim to this. And this has been going on for a while. This is not a new phenomenon. The erasure of North American history it did not just begin like decades ago. This started essentially like in the 1600s, you could argue, 1500s even, if you really want to get into it. Like, it's absolutely insane. You can find authoritative institutions centuries ago going out of their way to erase discoveries that people were making, going out of their way to erase the legends of the North American Indians. Like this is not a secret. This was going on. You can find countless books that talk about this stuff that were written during these periods of time. Right? That is one of the more powerful things you can do, by the way, is go read those older books. Go find those books from the 1800s. Right? See what they were saying. See what they were discovering in real time. Right? Because there's tons of insane stuff out there. Now, one of the things that has been hidden and has been erased and has been, absolutely just, one of the histories of North America that is now being completely eradicated is the arrival of the Welsh in North America around 1,000 years ago. Of course, you can't have Europeans showing up in North America before Columbus, although, to be fair, now mainstream is willing to admit a little bit that, Icelandic people may have showed up here and there, but they only show up for like 2 seconds and then they leave. They don't really do anything, right? That's really all the mainstream is allowing. The reality is, we have archaeological evidence and historical evidence that paints a completely different picture of what kinds of people were arriving in North America at various points in history. Now, the North American Indians have this in their histories. Like I said earlier, a lot of their stories tell us how they got here. Right? They are new arrivals themselves. They are not native. Right? If you really want to look for the native peoples, the native peoples were eradicated. Right? Whoever the hell the natives were on America thousands of years ago, they were wiped out. And there are various reasons and events that take them out. But the people we call Native Americans today are not native. Nobody is native, right? And I've already talked about that. And I'm not going to get too crazy into that. But we have to remember that is the scientific fact. All right? Nobody who was living in America in the past, let's say, millennia is native. All right? It's just nobody's native. Or nobody, especially who exists today, is a descendant of whoever the hell was originally native. That's not happening. Right? And we have all the scientific evidence and the historical evidence to prove that. But if you're not familiar with this stuff, there's a very simple reason why. This is the stuff that you are not allowed to hear about. You are not allowed to talk about it. Right? The stuff that we're going to get into here, this will get a lot of people fired from their academic jobs. So a lot of academics don't even know this exists, or if they know it exists, they think it's a hoax. And the only reason they believe that any other kind of story that goes outside of the mainstream version of history is a hoax is because they have been told it's a hoax. These people have not done any scientific experimentations. They have not gone out there and peer-reviewed any of the evidence. They haven't done any of that. That's the reality. Nobody is peer-reviewing anything at all. All right, that's all garbage. That's all buzzword crap for the public. Oh yeah, it's peer reviewed. This guy and this guy, looked at it and they agreed and blah blah blah, and they have degrees, so it must be true. And then when you go and you look at how they did their peer review, it's like two buddies who are both pushing the exact same narrative, who say something else that goes against them is a hoax. That's the peer review system. And don't get me started on what they found out, to where all these other papers that have been written, like the vast majority of them nowadays, are all just fraudulent garbage that have never been peer reviewed. Right? The headline will tell you they've been peer reviewed, but they're not peer reviewed. And if they are, they're peer reviewed in a corrupt way. Okay, so you get the point, but that's the scientific reality. This is science. This is everything I'm saying is based on scientific fact, real discoveries. The reality is our modern historical institutions and our scientific institutions are not interested in the truth. They don't care. Right? They're interested in a paycheck. They are interested in the fame. They want to inflate their ego, and they want to be the one that makes the main discovery, and they are not going to shake the boat if the discovery goes against what the mainstream is demanding of them. It's that simple. There is nothing else to it. It is just ridiculous. Okay. So, when we look at North America, we have a problem. Because the modern mainstream version of North American history completely ignores the mountains of archaeological and historical evidence that paint a completely different picture. And they've gotten away with it because certain power structures have access to vast, just vast amounts of resources that can subdue and destroy any bit of evidence that goes against what they want. And that is exactly what has happened. You can find instances of this everywhere. Everybody by now should know what the Smithsonian, for example, is doing. That whole institution is not interested in preserving history. They do not care about real science. They have a specific agenda that they are pushing, and they are going to push it. And they are doing it. And they will destroy whatever needs to be destroyed to do that exact thing. The agenda comes first. Right? There's no way around that. All scientific evidence of what the Smithsonian, for example, has done proves that in volumes. So, and I'm not going to get into that either, but that's just, this is what we're, okay. I know, okay, we got to talk about the show. So, what I want to cover today is, I want to go into the Prince Madoc legend, or the Prince Madoc history. Let's call it a history because that's what it is. I want to talk about Prince Madoc, and I want to see if we can't get a better foundational idea of what was going on during the period of time that Prince Madoc will be blown over to North America, what date this actually happens in, and what events were going on around it, kind of around the world. Because the problem with Prince Madoc is that, well, there's not the problem, but one of the things that we need to lock down if we're going to have an understanding of general history in general, like that, general history in general, is that we have to try to kind of figure out where other world events line up with like this particular event, because that will help us build a better chronological picture so that we can start, placing other outside events alongside other events so that we can get an idea of what actually happened so we can get rid of the current AD BC garbage system. I mean, okay, that probably didn't make sense because, okay, what I mean is that we have to figure out when this event happened relative to real chronology, because once we do that, we can use that as a calibration for other events around the planet, right? Or at the very least, we can use that as a calibratory event. Is that a word, calibratory? We can use that as a calibration event for other events that will take place in Europe. Now, one of the main reasons why this is extremely important to figure out, I mean, obviously it should be, obvious to be important because we're just trying to find the truth, but because the Prince Madoc story deals with one of the catastrophe events that hits this planet, and it is the last major catastrophe that will hit Earth, if we can pinpoint these dates, how many years ago this actually took place, that will also help us pinpoint when the last major catastrophe took place, in this case, the Zero event. And then if we can date that year-wise, if we know how far away we are right now from the Zero event, then we can compare that to other cultures all over the world who also record the Zero event, and we can get a better idea of how old certain aspects of all kinds of things are all over this planet. Does that make sense? Okay, it'll make sense as we move on. So here, let's get into this. I know, I've rambled long enough. Shut up. So, Prince Madoc. There's two specific dates that are aligned with the Prince Madoc event. And so by that I mean there are two different dates that historians will give to when Prince Madoc will arrive in North America. And that is around the 560s AD and around 1170 AD. Now, obviously, this is using mainstream chronology, but we'll start here to get everybody's footing, and then once we kind of have an idea of the issues here and what we can do with this, then we will get into the real chronology, and we will look at archaeological and even linguistic evidence that will paint a different picture of what was going on in the world during this time. And it's going to really show a completely different light on what happened a little while ago. Right? Okay. So we have two dates. The 1170 date is more accepted by, I guess we'll say, the majority of the people who believe this happened. And they believe that that date is accurate due to the documents that they have with the 1170 dating system. Right, so if you go and you look at some of these older documents, you will find a date that will look like 1170. Now, these particular documents are talking about a civil war taking place in Wales. All right, so the legend goes that, Prince Madoc decides to get out of this civil war situation because some guy named Gwynedd dies and there's a whole bloody succession thing going on to where people are fighting. Prince Madoc says, screw this, and gets out of town, basically. And this general story is documented to the 1170 date relative to what kind of documents that we have, right? And so if you want to go learn more about this particular era and why, kind of the general story about Prince Madoc, you can go find those dated documents. Now, there's a problem with documents like this, of course, because we have 0 documents that have survived since 1170 AD. I mean, the reality is we have nothing physically that was originally made back in 1170 AD. Right? All of this stuff comes to light in the late Middle Ages. Right? This is when all of these stories start to appear. This is when all of these dates will start to appear as well. Right? So we already run into a problem when we look at the standard idea of Prince Madoc. Now, remember, I mentioned that there is a catastrophe related to the Prince Madoc voyage. When you start to look at these 1170 documents, what you're going to find is that you will find scholars saying that the catastrophe was this civil war. That Madoc leaves because of a catastrophic civil war, and that's why he sails away. And this is what the mainstream will essentially hide behind and do their best to completely ignore what is said relative to reality when we start to look at what the catastrophe actually was. All right? And don't forget, by the way, the reality is, whenever we look at any kind of documentation that is coming out of the Middle Ages, we have to be really careful because none of this stuff is original, right? These are all copies of copies of copies in the best case scenario. The reality is we know now that forgeries during this time period were a literal industry. People were getting rich off of, quote unquote, finding all kinds of documents that talked about Rome, that talked about the Welsh, that talked about anything, really. Right? People were making a ton of money off of this stuff. Right? This is why we find ourselves stuck with 3 Roman empires now. We don't have any archaeological evidence for 3 Roman empires, but we do have a lot of books that talk about 3 Roman empires. And interestingly enough, the Vatican seems to benefit from all of that. Very, very interesting. Very, very lucky on their part, right? Anyways, so when you're looking at the documents that do indeed come out of the early Middle Ages on up, you have to be skeptical. You should be skeptical anyways from a scientific perspective, but don't forget the time period and what was going on. Things get rough during this period. So then we come to the other dating methodology that was, as far as I know, it's Alan Wilson who pushed this side, and it has gained a lot of traction. It's 562. Now, that also will end up using a lot of the same documentation that the 1170 dating will use, but the Alan Wilson side has a lot of other stuff going for it, and there's a reason why they're willing to push it back to 562. So that's another 500 years back. So if we look at mainstream chronology, we have the Welsh showing up at the earliest, or at the latest, around 1,000 years ago. And at the latest, around 1,500 years ago. Now, both dates go against current mainstream rhetoric, right? You cannot have Europeans showing up that early. You're not allowed, right? It's literally not allowed. How do you like that? Like that is the point we are right now in our society, to where you are not allowed to follow evidence and point out that something different happened in history. You're literally not allowed to do it, right? That's how corrupt everything is. Okay. So we have those 2 dates. So the question arises, which date is correct? Right? Okay. I mean, those two dates are fair. I mean, 500 years apart, essentially. 600, really. That's one hell of a gap. And you should think it's a gap. You know, one of the problems in history nowadays is that people will just throw around centuries and millennia like it's nothing. Oh yeah, Egypt is 5,000 years old and we know everything about it. Yeah, no problem, bro. Oh, 10,000 years ago, the Clovis? Oh yeah, we know it all. Don't worry about it. They were the first. We know don't even ask questions. Right? People, historians, I don't consider historians people, or geologists either, by the way. These people, in quotes, they talk as if they know everything that was going on centuries and millennia ago, and it's not a problem. Like, we have all of this detailed information, and you can't question it, because they know everything. Right? It's insane. But 500 or 600 years, that's a gap between these two dates that is serious. I mean, how much can happen in 1 year in your life? Look at your life in 1 year. Like, look at not just your life. I know if you're chilling at home all day staring at a wall, then maybe not much has gone on. But look at the world around you, right? In 1 year, insane events can take place, right? In 1 decade of your life, look at how much has changed. Look at how human society has absolutely changed. Look in the past 20, 30 years. Right? In one lifetime right now, you could be born in like the 60s. Let's just say you were born in the 60s. The amount of change that you have seen over that period of time is just mind-boggling. Right? Everything has changed. Everything. All of human society has changed. Everything that goes on now has changed. Everything. It's a completely different world. And that took place under a century. So if you're going to tell me that there's a gap of 5 centuries here, you know, that's asking a lot of me. Right, and to say that nothing changes either, by the way. Right, so this is really an insight, by the way, into how crappy chronology is in the modern age. Right, to say that nothing goes on for centuries is ridiculous. That's not how humans operate. It just doesn't work like that. Humans are constantly moving. Humans are constantly pushing. Right, they're constantly doing things. So it's not really weird, by the way, if you think about humans like that. You know, in reality. To have the Welsh showing up in North America. It's not really weird. The weird part is why they get over to North America, and we'll get into that in a sec, because we have to date that event. Okay, so those are the two dates. So which one is correct? Well, I will posit that neither is correct, because both dates, 562 and 1170, are both predicated on modern chronology. Now, I want to give some credit to Beckett and Wilson really fast. While they do use mainly mainstream chronology still, at least Alan Wilson, I know, he does admit that, like, the Dark Ages probably never happened, right? He was aware of that. And, of course, he's also aware of Velikovsky as well, which is nice. I just want to throw that in there. So to give that guy some credit of looking beyond the mainstream. Because that really gives his work, which is very scientific and historic, you know, more credibility. Like, he went out of his way to look at the science, to look at the real history, and just to follow, you know, where it led him. And that's where it led him. It led him to 562 AD. And then it painted a particular picture of those adventures from there on. All right, so that's good stuff. That's how we're supposed to do history. But at the end of the day, it is still predicated basically on mainstream chronology. So what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is that we know mainstream chronology is wrong. We know for a scientific fact that mainstream chronology is absolutely, completely just bonkers. Like, it's insane. It's just, you know, these dates have been pulled out of people's butts and they just thrown out there as scientific fact. And then after, you know, centuries of people saying this, it becomes the truth. And, you know, and the time we live in right now, you know, we've had centuries upon centuries upon centuries of lies being perpetuated as the truth. And that's where we are. And that's a scientific fact, by the way. Remember, like I said earlier, you know, during the Middle Ages, this is where all of our history comes out of, by the way. Right? This is supposed to be where finally somebody decides to collect and create a worldwide history. And of course, in the 1500s, let's say, 1400s, 1300s, Where are they getting their information from? Right? How would they know any of the stuff that they would know? They don't have the internet. Communication is slow as balls. How are you going to really compile? I can't even speak. How are you going to compile an entire world history when you don't have access to the kind of information that you really should have if you are going to create that kind of a situation? You can't, and they know that. So that's why we have tomes of historic, or libraries, I should say, hidden libraries in people's basements randomly get discovered, which have all of this information that completely, perfectly fill in the gaps that these historians had, right? Petavius, Dionysius Petavius, Scaliger, these guys, they just magically find stuff exactly when they need it, all the time, no problem. Anyway, so this is where these histories are coming from, and most historians nowadays don't want to acknowledge this. They don't want to acknowledge, even though they know that the forgery industry was alive and well, they don't want to acknowledge it, because if they acknowledge it, that means that everything that they have studied is a lie. It's wrong, right? It's inherently wrong. Well, we are going to look at it scientifically and call it out for what it is. Mainstream chronology is wrong. If you are basing any of your discoveries on mainstream chronology, your dating is wrong. That's it. I don't know what else to tell you. It's wrong. So the 1172 or the 1170 date is wrong, and the 560 date is wrong. However, I do believe that they are both correct in the sense that they are both talking about the exact same real period in time that actually happened, right? Either 1172 needs to be moved to 560 or 560 needs to be 1172. But either way, these two dates need to be combined into one event, right? Let's get rid of the separation. And we can just call it the Prince Madoc event because we don't have a year for it, right? Neither one of those two dates give us any real good information, right, in and of themselves. Now, ironically, what's even funnier, by the way, is that the 1170 date might actually be a 170 date. Because remember, they always put the letter I before the rest of the dates back in the day, during a very particular period in time. Right? They will always put an I or a J for Jesus or Isis, or however you pronounce that. Isis, Isis. But that's what they would do, right? And there's a whole science on that. It's crazy. But you can see it. It literally shows an I. And that's what happened with the 1170 date. The 1170 date is actually probably more accurate because it's not 1170, it's 170. It's 170 AD after Jesus, basically, is what that date is telling us. Now we're getting somewhere. Now things are getting interesting. Because now a modern chronologist is screwed. Because they objectively do not have an 1170 date in their documents. They have a 170 date. 170 after Jesus. Now things are changing. Now, in my opinion, this is probably closer to the truth. Why? Because of the I, or the J. Now, I'm not religious before we go further into this because we got to talk about Jesus for a second, okay? It's only relevant in the sense that it exists, okay? So I'm not pushing Jesus. Nobody has to start eating bodies of Christ or whatever the hell people do. You don't have to drink blood. All right? You don't have to do any of that while you watch the show. Just go do your drugs and just listen and stay put. We're not going to start worshiping anybody. Okay. But this is key to history because in European history, they do indeed start dating for a period of time their chronology after Jesus. Right? So whatever the hell Jesus was, whoever the hell Jesus was, it had a big enough impact on society to where they were literally willing to base their chronology off of it. Right? And I'm not going to get into the biblical study side of things. I know that people right now can start saying, you can take this all over the map. We're not going to do that. I just want to point out that having Jesus in existence, having that I or that J, actually does help us. Why? Well, right now, as far as I can tell, okay, let's start fresh. So The zero event catastrophe is key here. And the reason why I call it the zero event is because this is where the powers that be decided to restart our chronology. All right, so it's not like I'm not trying to take credit for anything or something like that. I only call it that because this is what the European powers, this event, they decided to use this to start fresh, right? For one reason or another. Now, well, I mean, not for one reason or another. The reason why they do is simple, actually, right? The last catastrophe really did mess up society pretty good, right? It killed off a lot of people. It is not wholly destructive of the world. There were not huge mountains of water or floods, mud floods or anything. There were floods, but there weren't mud floods like, the way people say it. It was nothing like that, right? But it was destructive enough to where societies that existed on Earth were shaken to their cores. Right? That we did lose a lot of societies, civilizations, right? Mass migrations had to take place. It really was a good, I hate to use the term reset, but so let's not use the term reset. It very much was an event to where that changed everything. So, one day you had a life set up and you kind of had an idea of what the future would be. And then the next day, everything was completely different. Now you were in a completely new world after this catastrophe, and you were going to have to deal with that. Like, there's no way around it. Everything changed. You lost stuff. There are new, everything is different. So, that warrants this. I could see why ultimately, the powers that be, on one hand, would want to start something at, brand new. Okay, well, we will restart the chronology here at zero from what we just experienced, and then we will move on. All right. So this event will do that. Now, in the mainstream, right, we still use the AD BC situation, so that zero event is there in the mainstream as well. It's just clouded by all kinds of just false history, right? Phantom time, if you will. Dark ages that never existed. We have entire empires that never existed that are duplicates and triplicates of real empires that have, padded out the history, right? So we find a situation that instead of having a real date in the modern age from when the zero event actually took place, we now find ourselves, a couple thousand years away from it, even though that is not true, right? We only find ourselves a couple of thousand years away from the event now because mainstream historians tell us that. Like, that's it. That's the only reason why. If we look at the scientific and historical evidence, we find that we are not that far away from it. And this is where things can get hard to soak in because the event wasn't as long ago as people are comfortable with. Here, let me just give a basic rundown. I mean, the reality is right now, if we look at real chronology, it looks like, 0 AD, if you will. It was not 2,000 years ago, but it was around 1,000 years ago. And people have a hard time with that for several reasons. The first and main reason is that we've all been trained on mainstream history, right? We've all been trained on 3 Roman empires, on an ancient Greek situation, on Egypt, on the Mayans, blah, 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 right? Thousands of years, no problem. We know everything. And everybody has fallen for it to one degree or another. I'm there as well, right? Pulling myself out of mainstream chronology has been an unbelievable pain because of how embedded the psychology is. It is crazy. So I completely understand. And even to this day, it's still hard, right? This is actually, okay, I won't get into that. Anyway, but if we look at the real history and the real science, it looks like 0 AD actually started around 1,000 years ago. All right. So if we look at the Prince Madoc situation and we look at that 170 AD date, things change a little bit, don't they? Yes, they do. Things start, a completely different picture of history, and the way history flows is now presented to us. What this does is that it gives us a completely new framework within the work. So if we take that 562 date and we take the 170 date and we simply combine them, and in all honesty, we can start with the 170 date because it couldn't have been 562 in new chronology, right? Because that would mean that this took place 500 years ago, and that's not realistic. The evidence does not support that. The evidence does indeed support that these events took place probably around 1,000 years ago or so, maybe a little less. Right? So the 170 date's probably accurate to some degree. Now, how accurate is that date? That's a good question. That's a really good question, because we have to ask ourselves, when were these documents written truly about Madoc? Because we only have copies of copies. And we have to also ask ourselves, how reliable are these documents? Were any of them sort of forged? Were they touched up for, various reasons? That's where things get weird. Now, by the way, for those of you who are now wondering why there should be any validity to this at all, don't forget, the Madoc story is based on physical archaeological evidence in North America, and it's also based on North American Indian history as well. We haven't even gotten there yet. We're not even there yet. So I just want to throw that in there so everybody doesn't think I'm disproving myself before we go further. Right? But we do have to ask these historical questions, because I don't have answers to some of this stuff. This is the stuff we got to figure out. So how accurate is that 170 AD date? I don't know. I'm willing to bet it's potentially... I'd be willing to bet that date was written as a general guesstimate by the historian that was writing about it. Maybe. See, this is where things will get weird. All right, so, okay. I started to talk about why the Jesus thing matters. All right, here's why this matters. Jesus exists only after the zero event. This is why we have a 0 AD. This is why in theory, you should not find Jesus, before this event, because there's no Jesus-like figure or Jesus event or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't exist until this catastrophe happens. Or I should say, it doesn't exist until after this catastrophe happens. Right? This is the key. So, if Prince Madoc and all of his men know about Jesus, then that means that they are definitely right after this event, which means that these guys know about the catastrophe. And there's a highly good chance that they lived through it. Now, the next thing we have to also keep in mind and look for, because this is what I'm digging around and I'm trying to figure out, is, did Prince Madoc know about Jesus prior to going to North America, or did he find out about the Jesus figure after he returns to Europe, or did Prince Madoc even ever know about Jesus? Right? This is going to be one of those, this is one of the keys, actually. If we can figure this out, we can really start to date Prince Madoc's arrival in North America. Here's why this matters. If Prince Madoc arrives in North America and he already knows about Jesus, that means the zero event already took place. Right? It already happened. And potentially he may not have even been alive he may not have lived to see it, actually. He may not have been born. Right? Now, I know this might sound like this is contradicting what I was originally talking about, but we got to lay this out, because this is an interesting problem. If Prince Madoc already knows about Jesus, what this means is that the zero event itself, the catastrophe that Mars will usher in to create this particular event, already went down. Prince Madoc already lives in a semi-post-apocalyptic world. So, what this means is that Prince Madoc cannot have been a victim directly of the major portion of the cataclysm that hits Earth. Right? And for those of you who are wondering what this cataclysm is, it's simple. So during the 0 AD time period, there is a point in time where the planet Mars comes fairly close to Earth multiple times. And Mars will approach Earth in 12-year intervals. And this is recorded by civilizations all over the world, right? You have the god of war approaching Earth multiple times. This goes on maybe 5, 6, 7 times, with one of the times that Mars approaches Earth being exceptionally destructive. Right? This would be the zero event itself. Right? People were able to see Mars in the sky. They would see Mars's orbit approach Earth, get closer, and then, as Earth's and Mars' orbit would continue on, Mars would pull away. Mars does not cross Earth's orbit like Venus did before. Right? Venus doesn't really matter too much at this point. But what's going on is that Mars is still trying to find its current orbit that it has today. Right, and in doing that, there's a situation to where Mars will approach Earth multiple times for a short period of time at 12-year intervals, and Mars is surrounded by a field of debris from the Venus event. Right, and people see this. Right, this is where all of our ancestors talk about the god of war being surrounded by, war horses or demons or devils or angels or whatever. Right, they're describing all of this cosmological debris that Mars is trailing along. Now, one of these close approaches will be close enough to Earth to where Earth and Mars will interact electrically, and a lot of bad stuff will happen on Earth. Earthquakes, hurricanes. You'll have, and I mean massive earthquakes to where shorelines will sink. We lose some islands, stuff like that. It's pretty brutal. You will also find all kinds of disease raining down from the sky. You'll find tons of meteor showers, just crazy stuff happening. But that's the zero event, the major close approach to Earth that happens once by Mars. That's the zero event. That's what the powers that be will end up using as their 0 AD event. That has nothing to do with Jesus, by the way. Nothing to do with Jesus. Right? The powers that be are the ones that created this. They don't care about Jesus. The Vatican does not care about Jesus. Nobody cares. Nobody in power right now cares about this. They want you to care about it. Right? It's important for you to care, but they know what's going on, right? They're well aware of what they're doing. They know all this crap. This is nothing new to them, right? They made the chronology for themselves to gain and keep power. That's it. The chronology is not here for real historians to know the truth. It's not here for scientists to figure stuff out. The chronology in its modern sense right now, the AD BC chronology, is there for nothing less than controlling the masses. That's it. That's all it's there for, right? Jesus, it seems like, and this is kind of a completely different show, and I think I talked about it, but the Jesus character or characters, which gets interesting, they don't like that guy, or they don't like those people. Right? The Jesus thing is something that the mainstream or the people that are in power right now wishes never really existed, and that's a whole other separate insanity. But yeah, okay. Anyway, all right. So back to Prince Madoc. Okay, so if the zero event has happened, or I should say, I know I'm losing my train of thought. I know. God. Ugh. Okay. Prince Madoc, Jesus. Okay. If Prince Madoc knows about Jesus, that means that he was not around for the actual zero event to happen. Okay? Because Jesus didn't exist during that period of time. The Jesus character will come later. The Jesus character will come, decades afterwards. Right? And I don't mean, somebody born of a virgin who's, metaphysical God. That's not what I mean. For whatever reason, all throughout the planet, after the zero event happens, after this catastrophe takes place, there actually is, for some weird reason, either a person or a group of people that show up on various parts of the planet and start preaching, peace and love, right? And that's there. It's weird. I know. I'm not going to get into it, but that exists, and it does bring up a lot of questions, which absolutely does not require a god, by the way. Okay, you don't need any of that. There's no reason for that. Right? It's just very interesting that this happens. So the Jesus character will matter to the Welsh at some point in time. All right, so if Prince Madoc knows about Jesus, that means the main event has already passed. All right, what if Prince Madoc doesn't know about Jesus? Well, if he doesn't know about Jesus, then what that means is that Prince Madoc could have survived the zero event catastrophe And the zero event catastrophe itself could have been the catalyst that ultimately sent him over to North America. All right, so if we can figure out if he knows about Jesus or not knows about Jesus, that can help us pinpoint that might be able to help us pinpoint some of the real chronology revolving around Prince Madoc. Now, here's where it gets weird. I can't find a reliable answer on whether or not Prince Madoc himself ever knew about Jesus or not. So the reason why I say this is this. There's a lot of artifacts that will be found in North America and are still being found that have the Welsh language that reference Jesus. And some of the references to Jesus will reference Prince Madoc simultaneously. But the question I have is, are these post-mortem references in which people later will make monuments to this in North America? Or when Prince Madoc, is eventually killed in North America, yeah, spoiler, Prince Madoc dies in North America. He dies and North American Indian tribe kills him. That's another story for another show. Are those epitaphs legitimately written during the time he died? Right. This is my question. And I don't feel, and maybe it exists, but I don't feel I've seen enough positive information that proves conclusively whether or not Prince Madoc knew about Jesus or not. Right. It gets crazier too, and here's where some of our problems will come into play. So if Prince Madoc lives through the actual zero event, right, the main catastrophe that Mars will usher in, if he survives this, then he won't know Jesus. However, Prince Madoc, after a decade of being on North America, will go back to Europe, grab a bunch of people, and then they'll come back to North America. Had the Jesus figure shown up during that period of time? What I mean by this is that the catastrophe could have blown Prince Madoc and his men over to North America, and he didn't know about Jesus. And then when he arrives back in Europe, the Jesus figure has already shown up. Right? It's already spread to a certain degree. And people are already, I don't want to say worshiping, but using his ideologies. Right? So Prince Madoc would have then learned about Jesus and then gone back to North America. And then you could have had, after he's killed, then you could have had epitaphs, referencing him and Jesus simultaneously. But this is the weird part, right? Because this is the gray area of the Prince Madoc history. And there's another interesting issue too. Now, the zero event really only records, as far as I can tell, this is what the powers that be did, really marks the most destructive point of contact with Mars that Earth will have. All right, this is where they decide to set it, and it makes sense. Like I said, it's pretty damn destructive. Right, it's not earth shaping and it's not earth wiping, but it's pretty damn painful, right? And it creates the scene that we see today, right? It creates Earth's current 365-day orbit. It creates Earth's current latitudinal orientation. This is where all of that comes from. It explains why, what happened to the Mayas or the Egyptians and, well, everybody really, or the Egyptians that came after the people who built the pyramids. Anyway, it explains all of that. So it's a pretty major event. And of course, the powers that be are descendants of powers that be from back in the day. So there's a long chain of keeping some stuff going here. Anyway, so it makes sense that they would use this event as their zero date. Fine, whatever. But here's the other problem. Mars doesn't just approach Earth once. Right? There's a span of time within, I believe, a century or so, to where Mars comes, relatively close every 12 years, for less than about 100 years. So one of the things I find that people don't fully appreciate about cosmological catastrophes is that it doesn't happen in one day and then everything is all happy and hunky-dory the next day. Right? If you're going to claim that any of these cosmological catastrophes take place, it's going to take time for the solar system to clean itself up. Let's put it like that, right? And we have to remember that even after the zero event takes place, Earth is still going to suffer some minor catastrophes from cosmological events that are still taking place in the sky. Right? This is why you find all these crazy records the further you go back in time of all this stuff happening in the night sky or the day sky. We don't see it today because all of this stuff is gone. It's done. It's been cleaned up, right? The events have taken place. Right? We don't have an analogy to it right now. But back in the day, it was something they were dealing with on a daily basis. Right? There's a period of time after the zero event to where earthquakes are a real problem, not because Mars is still close by, but simply because the Earth is still recovering from the catastrophe. Right? There's still problems. There's still issues. Everything is still settling. I mean, right now our solar system is still settling. Right? Our solar system is not clockwork, just in case anybody was wondering. Right? That's not how it works. The planets are still settling into like major orbits. And all of this stuff, of course, is driven by electricity and all that. I'm not going to get into that. Anyway, so, each time Mars would come close to Earth, even if it didn't do major damage, there still would have been some fallout. So this is where things can get even more confused relative to chronology. Because right now it looks like Prince Madoc is a victim of some kind of a catastrophe that will push him in the direction of North America. And we can argue whether he was physically pushed or he just said screw it and set sail to get away from Europe and ran into North America. That's a different topic. But the main point is that Prince Madoc's journey will start or will be triggered because of a cataclysm, because of a catastrophe. This is a very major, important part of the story. But it lends to the question, which catastrophe? Right? What did it happen during the zero event, or did it happen on one of the fallout events? And this is where things can get weird. The reason why it gets weird is because Prince Madoc will eventually sail back to Europe after 10 years of hanging out in North America, and when he shows back up, Britain and the entire European area is essentially a wasteland. While it's true that in the past decade, it was recovering, it was still not a great place to exist anymore. Right? So when Madoc shows up, he tells everybody that North America is amazing. It's basically untouched. It's this happy place full of, bountiful resources and all of that. And so everybody's like, wow, let's get the hell out of here. Let's go. And that's what they do, right? They sail with like 700 ships or something, and they get out of Europe and they go to North America. They do that because Europe is it's not worth living in anymore, right? The cometary event, whatever event would blow Madoc over to North America, absolutely devastates Europe. Right? And it devastates other parts of the planet, but I don't want to get into it. But it doesn't touch North America, right? And the reason why is simple. All the reports are that whatever cosmological body would do this damage, it enters the atmosphere in the northeast and it will travel southwest, right? And it will completely miss North America. North America doesn't get affected by the fallout of whatever this cosmological body is. Right, but Europe, Siberia, they're basically, the entry point, and they get screwed. So they get out of there. So what this means, as far as I can tell, or this would tell me, is that Madoc probably did not experience the actual zero event itself. He probably already knew about Jesus, and this cosmological body, which would do this excess damage, comes after the zero event. This would allow for Madoc knowing about Jesus. This would allow that 170 date maybe to have some validity. And so that's, all right, so yeah, we're doing some deductive reasoning here. I like that. I'm pretty much wasting everybody's time. All right, so another interesting part of this outcome, actually, is that it's believable. Because like I said, the zero event catastrophe is major. But Madoc doesn't really seem to report any of those major aspects of that catastrophe. He talks about having to deal with that cosmological body, starting a cataclysmic, situation in his area. But when he's over there in North America, they're not talking about the god of war in the sky messing with them, right? They're not talking about massive earthquakes. There's nothing like that. Right? They're dealing with other problems over in North America, but cataclysmic ones are not one of their issues. So what that would tell me is that the zero event had already taken place, and what Madoc and his people will eventually end up suffering from, and what will trigger his voyage to North America, will simply be, a small little cataclysm that happens from some of the fallout from the previous zero event destruction. Right? You would still have chunks of debris floating around out there, and Earth would potentially run into one of those pieces of debris. It's not weird, and in fact, we would expect it. So when we look at the Madoc situation, it's very interesting to see that things that we should expect to find in the history are sitting right there waiting for us. Right? Okay, yeah, so I think maybe that's what happened. Maybe that's what it is. That 170 date for Madoc, hell, that might be accurate. I don't know. That might be real. So what that means is that in 170, there was some kind of a cosmological disturbance. Some body enters the Earth's atmosphere, travels northeast to southwest, does some damage, and causes those minor problems. Now, I say minor, but that's the reality. The whole planet doesn't really necessarily suffer from this, at least not on the scale of like a real catastrophe. Yes, you might have had to deal with a couple of very, very cold winters and cold summers, potentially. Right, there would have been still earthquakes going on here and there like that, but you would not have been dealing with any kind of major, huge, large-scale catastrophe of what would have taken place during the zero event itself. This would have just been some fallout. Yeah, I wonder if that's it then. So then that would give the Jesus character time enough to exist, which would mean Madoc would already know about the Jesus character, which would mean that would also give, because if it's 170, that gives the Jesus ideology enough time to permeate throughout the culture and to take hold. And then that's exactly, and then we should expect to find the Jesus culture stuff in any of the artifacts that you find in North America, and sure enough, we do, right? We find the Lord's Prayer written over there in Welsh. We find all kinds of crazy stuff written in Welsh with Jesus attached to it, like in stone, right? It's there, and that would make sense. All right, so there's our conclusion. I just wasted an hour of your time. We could have just said that at the beginning of the show and moved on with but this is why, it's important because I want to go over more Madoc stuff. But if we can determine that Madoc comes after the zero event, right? The Mars is obviously no longer in the picture. Nobody fears the planet Mars at this point in time. Oh, actually, that's another thing you could look for, or we could look for. Does Prince Madoc care about the god of war, like his ancestors a century or two ago did? Or two before him would have. Yeah, that's something to think about. I'll have to look into that. Because if Madoc doesn't really care about the god of war in the sense that he's talking about it in the sky, because he would have lived, like I said, every 12 years, he would have lived, if he was around during the zero event, he would have lived long enough to see the planet in the sky, right? Which would have had to have influenced him to some degree. Him and his people. It would have had to have influenced him. And so far as I am aware, the god of war does not influence any of the Welsh during this period of time in any real appreciable degree, or in any real appreciable way. Yeah. Okay, so maybe this happens afterwards. Yeah, that's going to be my conclusion for now. So maybe that 170 date is the accurate date. Yeah, and what that means is that puts them a few centuries before Columbus. And if we really look at how artifacts degrade, how things change, that might actually be pretty damn close to the reality. Yeah, that might actually make sense. Columbus showing up a few centuries after the Welsh would. Yeah, 4 centuries after the Welsh are there. And then, and then, of course, when the Europeans start really showing up into real North America, they know about the Prince Madoc myth pretty quickly. It's funny, the Prince Madoc mythology to the European settlers that come over, they just took it as fact. And one of the main reasons why is because the history was right in front of them when they show up in North America. Right? Remember, the North American Indians know of the story as well. Right? Some of these tribes are wondering if they're the same people because they already know about them. It gets weird, right? And then, of course, people will run into literal white tribes Yeah, it gets weird. I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, maybe that's what happened. All right, well, we're done talking. We're gonna conclude with saying that Madoc did know about Jesus, which means that the Jesus event had already taken place, which then means the Zero event had already taken place, which means that Prince Madoc got to North America because of a cataclysmic event that was caused by the fallout of some debris from the main Zero event catastrophe. Yeah. Yeah, that's right.